Nobody saw her go, that was the point. That was the specific and deliberate condition she had arranged for herself on a December morning in 1969, when she told her manager she needed a few hours, told the people around her she was going for a drive, and took a rental car alone from the Memphis hotel where the band was staying to a cemetery in Macon, Georgia. A 4-hour drive each way, 8 hours round trip, a significant portion of a day that had other claims on it. That had a schedule that did not include an 8-hour drive to a cemetery and back. She made the drive anyway. She had not announced the destination. She had not explained the reason. She had simply taken the car keys and driven south on a gray December morning while the band slept and the schedule waited and the world continued its ordinary business without requiring her, for a few hours, to be any particular version of herself. The rental car was unremarkable. The roads were unremarkable. The December light was unremarkable. The flat, pale, slightly overcast quality of a southern winter day that asks nothing of you and offers nothing dramatic in return. She drove through Memphis and then through Mississippi and into Alabama and then into Georgia, covering the distance in the way you cover distances when you have given yourself enough time, without urgency, at a pace that was sustainable rather than determined, with the windows slightly cracked despite the cold because she needed the air to be moving. She had been thinking about Otis Redding for 2 years, not constantly. Not with the consuming quality of grief that people sometimes describe, the grief that arrives with its own weather system and reshapes every subsequent day in its image. More the way you think about someone whose absence has left a specific vacancy in the world, a vacancy with a particular shape, the shape of what that person was and what they gave and what, because they are no longer here, will never be given again in quite that way. Otis Redding had died in December 1967, a plane crash into a Wisconsin lake, 4 days before Christmas, 26 years old. Janis had been 24. She had heard the news the way you heard news in 1967, before the instant transmission of information had become the condition of daily life, slowly, through a phone call from someone who had heard from someone else, the information arriving with a delay that made it feel more shocking rather than less, because the delay had given the world time to continue without knowing, and the knowing, when it came, had to revise not just the present but the recent past as well. She had not known him well. This was the honest accounting. They had existed in the same world, the same music, the same era, the same general terrain of American soul and rock and the blues tradition that ran underneath both of them like a current. They had been on the same bill once briefly, at a festival where the backstage had that particular quality of organized chaos that follows large outdoor events, too many people moving through too few corridors, everyone slightly electric from the proximity of large-scale sound. They had spoken, in the way performers speak to each other backstage, quickly, warmly, with the particular shorthand of people who recognize each other across the distance of their respective audiences. He had said something about her voice that she had carried with her afterward, not because it was complicated or revelatory, but because he had said it with the directness of a musician talking to another musician, without the apparatus of public praise, and that directness was the register in which she trusted what she was told. She had known his music, though, in the way you know music that does something to you, not as background, not as entertainment, but as the kind of thing that finds a specific frequency in you and holds it. Sitting in the dark and listening to his records, she had felt the particular quality of recognition that only certain music produces, the sense that the person making it has solved, or is in the process of solving, the same problem you are working on, the problem of how to give something real without losing yourself in the giving, the problem of how to be enormous and intimate simultaneously, the problem of what to do with the excess of feeling that ordinary life has no container for, and that music, when it works, transforms into something that can be shared. Otis Redding was working on that problem when the plane went down in the Wisconsin lake. He had been 26 years old. He had been, in December 1967, on the verge of something. The Monterey performance had introduced him to an audience that was enormous and new, and the recordings he was making suggested that whatever he was reaching for was within reach. And then it wasn't. When he died, something left the world that she had been aware of and had not expected to lose. She had thought about him in the 2 years since, in the specific way you think about someone who is working on the same problem you are working on and who is no longer available to compare notes with. She had not visited the grave. She had not done the thing in the 2 years that she was now doing, driving 4 hours to a cemetery to stand at a stone and be in the physical proximity of the place where someone was buried. She did not entirely know why she was doing it now, on a December morning in 1969, with an 8-hour round trip and a schedule that had not planned for it. She did it anyway. The drive from Memphis to Macon takes you through a specific portion of the American South, the flat Mississippi terrain giving way to the gentle hills of Alabama, and then the particular landscape of Georgia, which has its own quality of light in December, softer than summer, the trees bare or nearly bare, the sky a pale, undramatic gray that is neither beautiful nor unpleasant, but simply the sky as it is in that part of the country in that season. She drove with the radio on low, not music, a talk station, the sound of voices she wasn't following, the particular company of the radio in a car when you want sound without the demand of meaning. She drank gas station coffee from a paper cup and watched the road and thought about various things, none of which she was tracking carefully. She thought about the Pearl sessions. They were producing something she believed in, something that felt in the making of it like the truest translation she had ever achieved of the thing she was trying to translate. The recordings had a quality she associated with arrival, the sense that the long journey from Port Arthur through Austin through San Francisco through everything had been moving toward something, and that the something was happening now, in a studio in Los Angeles, in the recordings with the full tilt boogie band. She thought about the year ahead, which was scheduled and demanding and full of the requirements that a career at the velocity hers had reached generated continuously and without apology. She thought about Otis. She thought about the specific quality of his voice, the way it carried an urgency that never resolved into desperation, the way it communicated need without collapsing into self-pity, the way it could be enormous and intimate simultaneously in a combination she had spent years trying to find the equivalent of in her own work. She had brought a harmonica. This was not entirely explicable. She did not play the harmonica. She had never played it, had no training in it, had picked it up at a pawnshop in Memphis the previous afternoon on an impulse she had not interrogated. She had been walking past the shop and seen it in the window and gone in and bought it, and it had been in her jacket pocket since then, and she had not played a note on it. She was not entirely sure what she intended to do with it at the cemetery. She drove. The cemetery was quiet in the way that cemeteries are quiet in December, not the ambient quiet of a park or a garden, but the specific quiet of a place that has organized itself around permanence. The trees were bare. The light was the same flat, pale gray it had been for the entire drive. The paths between the stones were clear and slightly damp from a recent rain, the grass at the edges of the paths still green but faded, the particular subdued green of southern grass in winter. She found the grave without difficulty. It was not obscure. Otis Redding was not an anonymous burial, was not a stone among stones indistinguishable from its neighbors. The grave had a presence that was appropriate to who it held, not ostentatious, not monument in the formal sense, but substantial, real, marked with the name and the dates and the specific weight of a life that had been extraordinary and had ended too early for the ending to make any kind of sense. December 10, 1967, 26 years old. She stood in front of it and read the dates again, though she had known them for 2 years. There was something about reading them in stone, in the specific materiality of carved letters in granite, that was different from carrying them as information. The stone did not allow the dates to be approximate or provisional. They were fixed. They were permanent in the way that only certain things are permanent, the way that the recordings were permanent, the way that the music she was trying to make was permanent, the way that what you leave in the world outlasts the body that made it regardless of whether the body was finished. She stood in front of the stone for a moment. She had not prepared what she was going to do here. She had not scripted the visit, had not decided in advance what she would say or think or feel. She had driven 4 hours on the understanding that the drive was necessary and that what she would do when she arrived would present itself. What presented itself was nothing at first. She stood at the grave and looked at the name and the dates and felt the particular inadequacy of standing at a grave, the inadequacy that has nothing to do with the depth of the feeling and everything to do with the mismatch between the feeling and the available forms for expressing it. There is no right thing to do at a grave. There is only the standing there, the presence, the acknowledgment that here is the place where someone ended and the world has since continued without them. She stood there for a while. The cemetery held its December quiet around her. No one else was present in the visible vicinity. The sky was the same flat, pale gray. She thought he was 26. She was 26 now, the same age, a coincidence of no cosmic significance and of considerable personal weight. She had more time than he had had. The thought was not a comfort exactly. It was simply a fact she was in the vicinity of and needed to acknowledge. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. Her fingers found the harmonica. She took it out. She had not planned this, or she had planned it without knowing she was planning it, which is the way certain decisions are made, the hand reaching into the pocket before the mind has announced its intention, the body ahead of the reasoning. She looked at the harmonica. A simple instrument, diatonic, 10 holes, the kind you could buy in any pawnshop in any city in America. She had never played one. She had no particular aptitude for it. She was not going to play something beautiful or meaningful or worthy of the person whose grave she was standing at. She put it to her lips anyway. She blew 3 notes. They were not good notes. They were the notes of someone who has never played a harmonica and is finding out in real time what the instrument does when you breathe into it. Rough, slightly off pitch, the sound of a beginning rather than an expression. She stopped. She held the harmonica in her hand and looked at it, then she put it in her pocket. She stood at the grave for another few minutes, not doing anything, not thinking anything in particular, simply being in the place, present in it. Giving the visit the time it required without knowing in advance how much time that was. Then she turned and walked back to the car. The drive back was quieter than the drive there. She turned the radio off somewhere in Alabama and drove in silence, which was different from the radio silence, fuller, more present, the silence of someone who has done something and is inside the aftermath of it rather than the anticipation. She thought about the 3 notes. They had been bad notes. This was simply true. There was nothing to romanticize about the sound, 3 unplayed notes made in a December cemetery in Georgia, nothing musical or meaningful about them in any technical sense. They had been the sound of an instrument being encountered by someone who did not know how to play it, but she had played them anyway. She had stood at the grave of a man whose music she had loved and admired and learned from and had not been able to properly mourn, not in the 2 years since the phone call, not in the private accumulation of absence that had been building since December 1967, and she had offered the worst possible musical tribute. 3 rough, off-pitch notes on a pawnshop harmonica bought on impulse the afternoon before, because the alternative was standing there in silence, and the silence had not felt adequate. The notes, however bad, were at least honest. They were honest in the specific way that bad music is honest, without the protection of skill, without the management that craft provides, the emotion exposed rather than translated, the offering raw rather than refined. She had not been giving him a performance. She had been giving him whatever was there when the performance was not available, the sound of someone who did not know how to do the thing and did it anyway, which was perhaps closer to the truth of what she had wanted to say than any polished tribute could have been. She thought he would have understood that. She thought he would have recognized the impulse to reach for the instrument even when you have no right to it, because the silence is worse than the bad notes, because the bad notes are at least something, at least an attempt, at least the honest admission that you are trying to say something you do not know how to say. She thought about what she was learning in the Pearl sessions, about the space between the performer and the performance, the space where the craft recedes enough that something more direct can come through, where the voice is not executing a technique but simply present, simply honest, simply giving without intermediary. She was getting closer to that space. She could feel it in the recordings, in the moments when what came out of her was less managed and more true. The 3 notes in the cemetery were that space at its most extreme. No craft, no technique, no performance at all. Just the sound of the instrument and the breath and the specific irreducible fact of being alive in December 1969, standing at the grave of someone who was 26 and then wasn't anything, and having a harmonica in your pocket and using it. She drove back through Alabama and into Mississippi and then into Tennessee and finally into Memphis, arriving at the hotel in the late afternoon with 8 hours accounted for and nothing to show for them except the harmonica in her pocket and whatever the day had given her that she did not yet have words for. She would not play the harmonica again. The harmonica stayed. In her jacket pocket through the rest of December and through January and February and into the spring, and she was aware of it occasionally the way you are aware of things in your pockets, at odd moments, when the hand finds it unexpectedly, when the weight of it surfaces into consciousness and then recedes. She did not take it out and look at it. She did not throw it away. It was simply there, the specific weight of 3 bad notes and a December cemetery and a drive through Alabama in silence with the radio off. In the Pearl sessions that followed, in the recordings that became the most fully realized work of her life, there was something present that had not been present before, or that had been present and had deepened, had settled further into the work, had found a way to be more directly itself. The musicians who worked with her on those sessions noticed it and described it in various ways, more settled, more certain, more completely inhabiting the space between the note and the feeling the note was meant to carry. Producer Paul Rothschild described it as arriving, the way you arrive somewhere after a long journey, not with drama, not with announcement, simply present in a way that earlier you were not. She did not tell anyone about the cemetery. Not the band, not Rothschild, not her manager. The drive and the grave and the 3 notes stayed private in the way that certain things stay private, not because they are hidden, but because they are too specific to explain, too particular to the interior landscape to translate into the exterior one without losing what made them true. It had been real. The harmonica in the pocket was real. The 3 notes in the December cemetery air were real, and she had driven home in the silence, and the light had faded over Mississippi, and that had been enough. That had been exactly enough.